if we refuse to do that, which we are mandated by distributive justice to do, it seems to be a further injustice. If, in addition, we say to those people, no, sorry, we're not even going to allow you to sell a kidney, to help your child.
Welcome to the first ever episode of the Political Philosophy Podcast. My name's Toby Buckle, and it's really, really great to have all of you here. This podcast is going to feature an interview every week with a prominent philosopher or a public figure who has something interesting to say about political philosophy. It's going to be a mid-range format, meaning about 45 to 50 minutes per interview. So this is some conversations to listen to for your commute, some discussions while walking the dog, or a digression while doing the dishes, and I don't have any more alliteration to go with that. My goal here is I am incredibly passionate about this subject. I love it, and I could just think about it for days, and I want to share that with all of you. I also want to share how the politics, as it were, is something that's inside you and all around you. It's something that's in everything that you do. It's not just this thing that happens in the news or in the halls of power. It's necessary and desirable to the human condition. So this isn't going to be just one more political talk show where the only purpose is to defend one of the main political parties, though I have my personal preference on them, certainly, nor is it going to be to simply defend a particular ideological position or to attack a different ideological position. There's a lot of this going on right now, and it's necessary and important, but actually it can be a bit narrow-sighted. And I want to ask some deeper questions surrounding that. I am a person of the left, and I'm going to make no bones about that on this podcast, but I want to ask some questions of why do left-wing values exist in the first place? How did they come to be? What do they mean today? And what are all of the different things in the landscape around that? What are all of the different ideological positions out there? And what does all that mean for us and how we live our lives? The one thing I'm most excited to bring you for this podcast series is our guests. I am incredibly grateful and somewhat overwhelmed by how awesome the response to my interview invites has been. We have got some of the most qualified and capable people, literally and without hyperbole, in the world to talk on these issues. I'm wary of taking too much time up in this introduction, and I do just want to get straight to our first interview. So I'm going to save the full list of people speaking on the show until the second, but please do stick around because we have some incredible people coming. Talking of which, my first guest is Professor Cecile Fabre. Cecile Fabre is a French-born political philosopher, moral philosopher, and academic. She's currently the Professor of Political Philosophy at Oxford University and will become the University Proctor this year. Professor Fabre has been thinking and writing about these issues and producing some really interesting and provocative books, including Social Rights Under the Constitution, Whose Body Is It Anyway?, Justice in a Changing World, and Cosmopolitan War, and Cosmopolitan Peace. I so enjoyed this conversation, and I've decided to make it the first interview in our series, even though it's a very challenging conversation in a lot of ways. We get into some really controversial moral issues. We discuss the case for legalizing prostitution or sex work. We get into the case for legalizing a free trade, a commodification of human organs. We discuss income inequality. And if you're wondering what all those things have to do with each other, then wait and see for our interview, because we draw some fairly clear lines between them. But we're actually kind of playing a trick here, which I'll give away at the outset, which is this. We're asking you to notice how you feel, what your intuitions are about these different issues. And I'll track my own intuitions as we go through this. And then to simply notice that the way you feel about one of these issues, or about one of the arguments for one of these issues, probably isn't coherent or logically compatible with how you feel about one of the others. And once you notice that contradiction, a trapdoor opens in your mind, through which lies the strange and weird world of metaethics, which is where we're going to guide you in this conversation. So, I so appreciated this conversation, and I so appreciated both the disagreements and the areas of genuine ethical insight I think we got out of this. More than anything, this conversation is challenging you. What's going on in your head? Why is it that you feel a certain way, and what does that mean? So, without further preamble, I've talked for a little bit. It is my absolute pleasure to bring you Professor Cecile Fabre. I am here today with Cecile Fabre from Oxford University. Professor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I just want to jump into some of the really interesting issues that you've been writing about. Before we do, why don't you just tell our audience a bit about you, the issues that you write on, and how do you see yourself? What, if someone asks, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
So I see myself as essentially a moral and political philosopher. I've worked on various topics, over the years, the rights that we have over material resources that we need, such as income, the rights that we have or don't have, over in body. Mm-hmm. I've written about prostitution, organ sales, surrogate motherhood. Mm-hmm. In the last 8 years or so, I've written mostly on the ethics of war and peace, after war. And recently, I've become more interested in the ethics of foreign policy, as well as the ethics of espionage. Actually, that's my current project. So I'm interested in basically rights, in general, and in particular rights of ourselves and rights in relation to the use of force.
Fantastic. So let's start with the first thing you mentioned, which is sex work or prostitution or whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. I generally say, this is an aside, I generally say sex work because I find prostitution just has a sort of...
Yeah, fair enough.
It comes pre-stigmatized, as it were. I think we're finally getting to the point, at least on the left, where people are open to hearing this argument. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to invite you to make it for us. Should sex work be criminalized? And if not, why not?
So I don't think sex work, should be criminalized. Even if you think that sex work is immoral, and I don't think that, but even if you think that sex work is immoral, it doesn't follow, that the state should turn it into a criminal offense. So first of all, it seems very unfair, unjust even, to brand as criminals, prostitutes who very often, enter into sex work because they don't have that many, other options. Second of all, turning to the case of customers, or clients. Again, it seems to me that the act itself of buying sex, even if it is immoral, is not wrong enough, to warrant being branded a criminal. So the general headline, is this: given how stigmatizing indeed and burdensome it is, to be subject to a criminal sentence, the offense that one commits has to be very, very serious indeed. And I find it very difficult to see how we could mount an argument, plausible argument, to the effect that the mere act of buying or selling sex falls into that category.
Do you think it's innately immoral? I mean, assuming,
No.
Consent and whatever is met.
Yeah, so assuming consent, no, I don't think there is anything wrong per se with the mere fact of offering money to have sex and giving sex, conditional, upon receiving money for it. What people find very, very troublesome, about sex work has little to do, it seems to me, particularly in a more secular age, has little to do, with the fact that an exchange takes place involving money and sex. And I think it has more to do with what goes around, that. So it has more to do with trafficking, for example, or with exploitation, But these phenomena, important though they are contingent. They're not part and parcel of the sex work, encounter.
So let's just run through some of the common counter-arguments you get, and just take them off the table fairly quickly. We already dealt with the idea of innate immorality. I mean, I agree with you. People have sex for all sorts of reasons, and this one doesn't seem innately immoral, but even if it is, that's not sufficient grounds for criminalisation. The next one you just alluded to is the first thing people will say if you talk about legalizing sex work is, but my God, don't you realize how many prostitutes are trafficked? What would be your response to that?
So my response to that, would be the following. Well, then, make trafficking, a criminal offense, which, by the way, would exonerate the prostitutes themselves, from criminalization, the traffickers, and those who are complicitous, in the trafficking, might, be regarded, as criminals. But that's different from making the act itself, of exchanging, money for sex or sex for money, a criminal offense.
Yeah, it just seems to me like a bad faith argument, because it's like saying, if you said, I think boxing should be legal, and someone says, so you're in favour of just walking around punching people in the face. Well, no, because one's consensual and the other isn't.
Right.
The other thing people would say is, but, do we really want to live in a society in which paying for sex becomes the normal way people have sex?
So I think that's a very good question, and it's a very troublesome question. There is a follow-up question to that, if I may ask it to anticipate. Would I want my son, to work as a prostitute? So let me take them in order. I mean, I don't want to live in a society, in which the main way in which people have sex is through commodified, sex work. And, there are all sorts of reasons, for this. There is much more, in my view, to sex, than, this particular kind of, exchange. Sex ideally, should, have a more playful, form, and so on and so forth. But again, I mean, it's a far cry from saying, I don't want to live in a society in which people routinely pay for sex, to saying, therefore, we should criminalize it. We should never forget, how portentous, the act of criminalization is. So that's my first point, is the portentousness of criminalization. I mean, the second point, is a more pragmatic point. I mean, it only goes so far, which is that, criminalization probably will not be the answer, to, or the best way, to tackling, that worry. I would rather put my faith in, proper sex education, a more holistic, sex education at school, from a very young age.
Right. And I mean, I think following on from what you said, it seems like if there are forms of sex which are much better and much, more fulfilling than prostitutional sex, we should be arguing for them.
Yes, I agree.
Rather than, and maybe, these worries are better expressed by a more open societal conversation about how good sex can really be, as opposed to how bad it can be.
How bad it can be, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Let's move on to one final objection, which is we live in a very, very unequal society. I mean, I live in America, which is more unequal still.
Right.
Would this just reinforce that inequality? Would it just become poor people, poor women in particular, are forced to sell sexual services, and then the rich can just sort of enjoy, as it were, the poor in that way?
So, so two things. I mean, first of all, it already is the case, arguably, that poverty, as well as addiction, actually, fuels,
right.
Prostitution on the supply, side. It's not the case that only wealthy people buy sex. A lot of, not very wealthy people, buy sex, as well. I mean, the worry here, is this, that there are, forms of economic and social domination, which prostitution both embodies, but also, strengthens. And, again, all of that has to be taken on board, but once more, it does not follow that the best response to this, is criminalization. The best response to this is a proper distribution of resources, more generally. That, it seems to me, would be the way, to think about, inequalities, instead of depriving an already very, very disadvantaged, group of one of the few means at their disposal, to get some income.
It strikes me that almost every argument, and we've covered the main ones that people make against prostitution, could also be made against coal mining as a profession.
Yes. Yeah.
It's fairly dangerous. It's not great for your health. It is comparatively well paid vis-a-vis other forms of manual labour. Would we want to live in a society where most people was coal miners? Is this what we'd want for our children? It seems like almost line for line, but no one, we might talk on the positive side about getting more clean energy, but I don't think anyone would think to criminalise coal mining, right?
Yes, good. Yeah, so I think, coal mining is a good example, because it's also unsafe, or can be very unsafe, and, the same can apply, to prostitution. I mean, the example I often use or, think of in that particular context is not so much, coal mining, but people who work in the fast food, industry, or in very, very, very demanding factory, conditions. I don't want to go around arguing that we should criminalize McDonald's,
right.
or manufacture, or manufacture in general. So, proper regulation and and working upstream, as it were, on the distribution of resources, seems to me, to be the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to make one more point, which is that Martha Nussbaum, who has written a bit, about prostitution, says in one of her articles, or reminds us in one of her articles, that in the Middle Ages, if you were a teacher of philosophy, it was regarded as immoral to actually ask to be paid, for your teaching. The thought was, teaching philosophy is a very noble calling, which is incompatible, with demanding money, for it. And of course, nowadays, if you go around explaining professional teachers of philosophy that they ought to be willing to dispense their teaching for free, you're not likely to be met, with an enormous amount of sympathy. That only goes to show that the kind of value that we attach, to particular good is highly, or can be very context, specific. And I think we need to bear that in mind as well, when we encounter arguments to the effect that sex is inherently such and such. as to be incompatible, with commodification, or not apt for commodification.
So I'm just having this thought talking to you now, but I could actually say the same thing about a lot of lines of work that I've done. So I've spent a lot of time working in non-profit development and essentially asking people to give money to charity, right? So there is an innately emotional component to that because people aren't going to be moved to give money on the basis of a statistic. Sometimes they are, but more commonly you've got to tell a story about human suffering and human pain. And to the extent that you are feeling it yourself and you're emotionally invested, you'll be more successful.
Of course.
And so you could put the same argument there of, well, is it wrong for me to get paid for that? Because it's such a personal thing, it's such an emotional thing. You're really sort of putting something of yourself out there, right? You could say the same for talking about ethical. You could say the same for...
We could say the same about musicians, for example. So I mean, I don't know how much time you want to spend on this, but I was watching on YouTube the other day, or rewatching, an extraordinarily moving performance of Mozart's Requiem. The conductor was Claudio Abbado. He was one of the best, conductors of his generation. He died, not so long ago. And at the end of the performance, he's almost crying. It's an extraordinary, moment. He's very, very moved. And in fact, the audience remains silent for almost a minute, before the applause takes place. So, there is no doubt whatsoever that Abbado was extraordinarily moved, to the marrow of his bones, by this particular performance. I would not find it shocking, to hear that he was paid, to conduct that, but the two are not, incompatible, necessarily. So that's another example, to add, to your example of charity work or, non-profit work.
So let's move on to another thing then, because in this case, I agree, we sort of have a view of like money and commercialization as like inherently corrupting somehow, which doesn't necessarily cash out. But one area which you've argued for, where I think I'm still retaining that intuition, is the idea of the commercialization of organ sales.
Of organs, yeah.
That to me, then my intuition that it's somehow degrading to sell your emotional labor or your sexual labor. I don't really have that intuition. But then when it comes to selling your body parts, that intuition just dials right back up to 10 for me. So could you walk me through the argument in favor of, if I want to sell a kidney or my blood or my bone marrow, should I be restricted on like a free market? Should I be restricted?
So this is interesting because I suspect that many people would have the opposite, set of intuitions, from you. Would say, well, no, I think there is a problem, emotionally with selling sex, but there is no problem with selling a kidney. I mean, my kidney is not important, to me. So I find it interesting that you seem to be saying, the opposite, of that. I mean, so my arguments generally in favor of organ sales are in some respects similar, to my arguments, in favor, or I should say against, the criminalization of, sex work, namely an appeal to freedom, to the freedom to, within limits, and I know we'll come back to that later on, the freedom to dispose of your body, as you wish. So the thought is this, in just the same way as it is up to me to decide, the conditions under which I'm willing to have sex, it is up to me to decide, up to a point, the conditions under which, I'm willing to divest myself, of my blood, for example, or of a kidney or bone marrow. Now, it might be better if I were willing, to give it for free, but it's unclear to me that it's immoral of me not to want, to give it for free, at least under certain, circumstances. So appeal to the freedom within limits, the freedom to dispose of your body as you wish is, one kind of argument which I think applies to both, sex works and organs. Now, there is something else, with organs, which I don't find immediately apparent, in the case of sex works, which is this. So imagine, as is the case in Britain, actually, that we're not allowed, to sell our kidneys. And picture a transplant operation. Every single member of medical staff who will take part in that operation will be paid. The one person who will not be paid will be the donor, thanks to whom, the operation can actually take place. And I find it very odd that we should say on the one hand that it's entirely fair enough for the surgeon, the nurse, the post-op care assistant to be compensated for the service that they are giving, to the patient, but it is not appropriate for the organ donor to want to be compensated for the fact that he or she has divested herself, of their kidney. There is an asymmetry there, which I find somewhat problematic.
So you would view organs, blood, body parts as essentially a form of capital, a form of wealth. I have my...
Yes, I would. Yeah, I would, and I know that's a very, very controversial view, but I feel no attachment whatsoever, to those parts, of myself. So that's that informs, in part, my arguments, in favour, of the commodification of organs.
So it's weird. It's not just that I have an intuition one way or the other. It's that I find specific counter-arguments convincing in one case and not in the other. So I don't particularly find... So there's two counter-arguments that are almost directly analogous. There's commodification and exploitation. We talked about commodification a lot, but the image that really sort of troubles me with organ sales is people who are living, there's so many people in America right at the poverty line, and the way they get something that their child desperately needs is they have to sell a kidney, and there's already a pretty big life expectancy gap between the poor and the rich. Would this only exacerbate that? That's sort of... Now, that doesn't scare me with prostitution for whatever reason. It does with this. So let me get your response to that first, and then we can talk about it.
Good. I can see... So I can see one reason as to why you don't find that problematic in the case of prostitution, whereas you do find it problematic in the case of kidneys, which is that to actually go through life with only one kidney is not trivial. It can really amount to fairly severe health problems further down the line. So one interesting question to you, or thought, for you to ponder is whether or not you would have the same reservations about blood, donation, or donation of liver cells, which, replenish, or bone marrow, donations. So that's one. That's the first thought, which I think is worth, bearing in mind. But let's stay with the kidney, example. So, don't get me wrong, I am deeply worried and, morally exercised by the profoundly unjust situation which you describe, in which, people in dire financial straits feel that they have no choice but to, sell a kidney. Now, then it seems to me that we have two options. We say to those people, well, we are not going to bring about, the social justice reforms, which will mean that you will have more financial resources, than you currently have. So option one, we say to those people, well, we're not going to bring about, those reforms, but we will not also allow you to sell a kidney. So basically, you have no way out of your predicament whatsoever. Option two, we refuse to bring about those social justice reforms, but we allow, that option, of selling a kidney. Well, it's so clear to me that the second is morally worse, than the first. So, to put the point somewhat differently, if we refuse to do that which we are mandated by distributive justice to do, it seems to be a further injustice. If, in addition, we say to those people, no, sorry, we're not even going to allow you to sell a kidney, to help your child.
So to answer your question, you might actually be changing my mind in real time. No. With regards to blood sales, I don't have that intuition. If someone wants to sell their blood, fine, right? I think the kidney thing sticks in my craw, as it were, because of it is, like you say, non-trivial to live a life with one kidney, right?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So I think it's a very fair point, and that's why in my book I tried as much as I could to separate or to distinguish, between different kinds of, organs, and particularly with respect to how risky, it is to live without, that organ, but also relatedly, whether the organ or tissue replenishes, itself. It seems to me that makes a very, very important difference. I still think that, there is something. Well, let me put it differently. So, the well-off, we, the better off, have various views about how risky it is to live, without those organs, and so on and so forth. And in order, to be faithful, to those views, and in order to honor our worries about, exploitation, we block that avenue, to the very poor. But it seems to me that we are asking the very poor to pay a very, very high price for the combination of both our insistence that we should be able to live by our own moral commitment on the one hand, and our refusal to distribute resources properly, on the other hand, in such a way that they wouldn't ask themselves that question in the first instance: am I going to have to sell my kidney in order to have my child? Does that make sense, what I've just said?
Yes, it does. And I think it really goes to add a sort of highlighter, if one were ever needed, to sort of how poisonous inequality can be.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So I've actually gone around the block on this, and I've decided, after some thought, this is one of the big wheelhouses of political philosophy. I don't think wealth inequality is innately immoral, insofar as if I'm in a bar and Bill Gates walks in, it's become much more unequal, but I don't see that I've been harmed or wronged in any way. With that said, it just bleeds into everything else, and it makes making sensible decisions about how you regulate people, how you regulate their sex lives, their bodies, their economic interactions. It makes everything else so much more tricky and problematic in the face of that. Yeah. No, go ahead.
Yes, I agree. That's good. So I agree with the second part of your point. That there is something extraordinarily corrupting, in the ways that you've just described about inequality. I'm less comfortable than you seem to be, with inequality per se. So, one of the most famous, thought experiments was devised on this by Derek Parfit. And the thought experiment is meant to test how strongly we feel about inequality per se. And it roughly, goes like this. Roger Crisp, whom you interviewed, recently talks about this as well in some of his work. Suppose that you have a group of millionaires and a group of billionaires, and then there's manna, coming from heaven. Now, if we take the view that, inequality per se doesn't matter, then, so long as we could give the manna from heaven to the billionaires, without any instrumental bad, without any bad arising from this, then there would be no objection, to it. My intuition is that in this particular case, we should give the manna to the millionaires, that there is something pro tanto bad, in a world in which we have some billionaires on the one hand, some millionaires, on the other hand, where we can distribute a resource which we decide we're not going to give, to the millionaires.
So this actually brings me on to my next question, which is the role of intuition. Just to sort of answer that thought experiment, we undeniably have an intuition about equality, and that's revealed by that case. I think morally correctly, though, there's clearly it's desirable and ethical to attain a certain minimum standard of living for everyone in a society. And I think the standard of living that we could in modern societies give and should be obligated to do might be counterintuitively high. We might be able to get everyone to actually a good middle-class living, whether or not they have the ability or inclination to work for it. We might be able to do that. But if you imagine two worlds, one in which everyone has an income of, I don't know, 50 or 60,000 a year, and then there's a few who have a bit more than that, and then another world which is identical, but one person is a billionaire. I'm sort of morally neutral between those two worlds. I don't really.
So in the second world, the only difference is that amongst the few who are better off, one of them is a billionaire. Is that the difference between
Yeah,
the two?
let's make it even simpler. You've got one society in which the income range is, say, 50 to 100 a year, right? And everyone falls in
Okay.
that range, no one's below it. You've got another society in which everyone's in that range, but you maybe have a handful of billionaires on top.
Yeah. So I'm not. My intuition. I mean, of course, how much weight we can ask our intuitions to bear, is another matter. But my intuition is that there is something more problematic, in the second world. Now, my view is not that, inequalities. Or let me put it differently. I mean, my view is not that whenever there is an inequality, we ought, all things considered, to remedy it. All I want to say, and it's a weaker claim, is that it's pro tanto, the second of your two words is pro tanto worse, than the first. Now, whether we ought, to bring, the second world closer to the first is a separate question. It might be that, in order to do so, we would have to act in ways, which would be unjustified, and so unjustified that we ought, all things considered, not to do it. But on my view, there would be a moral remainder, if you will. We would have sacrificed something, by not acting, and that something would be less inequality.
I'm not sure, because say you're in the second world, once you're in the second world, there's clearly a case to start taxing the billionaires, because if we
Right.
start taxing the billionaires and then we can get the minimum from 50 to 55,
Right.
say,
Right. Okay.
then that would just sort of be, there's just a very clear utilitarian logic leading you
Right.
there. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure that on the face of it, there's any moral difference between those two. I think it feels like there is, but I'm not sure that there is. But then there's all sorts of side effects in terms of like political economy, right? Would those billionaires then wield much more
Well,
power?
yeah.
I think
Yeah.
inequality of power
Right. Okay.
is a problem, right?
Right. Right.
And in some ways, it's probably always going to be impossible to separate inequality of power from inequality of wealth, because wealth is a form of power.
Right.
But assuming you could get a real clean divide, I don't know. I'm sort of agnostic on that question.
Yeah. So I think, well, so part of my intuitions are partly driven by, considerations of how the billionaire may have acquired his wealth, and of course, I mean, as there is a lot of work in the literature on the degree to which inequalities which can be traced to people's choices are morally acceptable, as distinct from inequalities which can be traced purely to luck. And it seems to me that if the billionaire is a billionaire by sheer brute luck, then the less well-off people might have a complaint actually against her. So why should you have all of that stuff? Whereas we don't.
Yeah, I think though that the dessert, even bringing dessert in at all, I feel like is a mistake, because no
Right.
one, even if you say luck, well, luck, your IQ is luck. You did not build your
Yes.
brain. You did not build your genes. You did not choose that you were born to a family that can give you an education. The amount of your life that you actually can claim was under your control, even stuff like the capacity to work hard, it's vanishingly small, if
Yes, I
existent at
agree.
all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know I just say, get the highest welfare possible, and the biggest
Right.
welfare losses occur at the bottom, so let's start there and map up,
Right.
right?
So I agree. So that, to my mind, is the morally urgent task. What you have just described. But it's precisely because I worry about the degree to which so much of what happens to us is traceable to luck. It's precisely for that reason that I worry, about inequalities. I do think there is something profoundly unfair, in the fact that some people just are born, are cleverer, than others, or are born. I'm even more exercised actually by, the degree to which the family in which we are born makes such a huge difference, it can make such a huge difference, over which we have very little control, over our life, prospects, relative to the life prospects of others.
But even stuff like, the phrase being in control, I think can be a little misleading, because even something like being a good decision maker
Yes, yeah.
is not in your control, right? And in a sense, it all just goes down to
Right. So
culture and genetics and upbringing, and all you're left with is the idea that suffering is bad, well-being, flourishing are good, and let's just move forward from there,
Right. So what you've just described, is compatible with two views. One which says what matters is not whether people have as much of whatever, resources, well-being, and so on as others. What matters is that they should have enough, that they should flourish enough. And if some flourish a little bit more than others, then it's not, something which is deeply concerning, morally speaking, so long as everyone, reaches a minimum, threshold. And of course, I can see the force, of that view, but there is a part of me which can't quite let go of the intuition that there is a sense in which, and it might be a very weak sense, but nevertheless a sense in which there is something to be regretted, to a world in which the billionaires have more, than the billionaires, particularly if they have done nothing whatsoever, to deserve it. I think the language of desert, is somewhat problematic there.
Yeah, so let's make explicit something that's been floating around this conversation up to this point, in that I was not disagreeing, but just noting an intuition of mine when you talked about organ sales, and you were, again, not disagreeing, but noting a counter-intuition of yours when talking about wealth inequality.
Yes.
So what weight do we, if what it comes down to is we actually just sort of feel differently about a particular example, what weight do we put on that feeling normatively?
So I think that's a very, very deep, very important question. I don't have a good answer to it. I don't work in meta-ethics, but that really is what meta-ethics do. Okay, so briefly, so when I say my intuition is blah, I never take that to be vindictive, and I realize that I may have given the impression of doing so in our conversation, but I never think, oh well, that's the end of the matter. So I think of my intuitions, and I think most philosophers I know of who work in those areas would say something similar. I mean, I think of my intuitions as simply the raw material, on the basis of which I try to construct reasoned argument. So the method that I tend to use, and I'm certainly not the only one, I think it's a very, very widely used method, is the method of reflective equilibrium that Rawls, describes, in a theory of justice. So, you start with a set of intuitions, and then you try and justify or articulate and explain why you might have that intuition, and then you examine when that intuition conflicts with other intuitions, and you look at the general principle that other intuition seems to illustrate, and then you try and move forward in the argument by working out which of those arguments achieves the greatest degree of internal consistency. That's an important test of plausibility. Which argument is vulnerable to the greatest number, of objections that you think at the moment are not answerable, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so there's two thoughts I have here. The first is when it comes to our intuitions about policy or policy choices, they're clearly not just a bit incoherent, but they're clearly completely incoherent. Right? And then the other thought is it's not just that they're not reliable, it's that they're actually reliably bad, in that most people through human history will have had some sort of intuition about what women can and can't do that doesn't at all cash out scientifically, or about race, or you read the writings of slaveholders who I think we think of it as like an economic form of exploitation, but many of them were completely aware that this made no sense in utilitarian terms or even in economic terms, but they had a very just passionate commitment to to just this way of life, right? And so it seems to me like our moral intuitions, there can be such a thing as just a straight moral illusion, right? Where it just really feels that something is a certain way, and
Right.
actually just in the case of, say, assuming women are, say, less intelligent or capable than men, most people in history will have had this intuition, right? But it actually is just factually false.
Yeah.
And I think you can have really strong intuitions in the case of, say, slavery that just are sort of ethically false. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I mean, so do you think there is a difference between? So you've said, okay, most people have had that intuition, about women, or about the appropriateness of holding in slavery, human beings, from particular ethnic groups and so on and so forth. And you've said it's just plainly false. Now, do you think that those intuitions have the same status, epistemic normative status, or at least epistemic status, as the thought that the Earth is flat?
No. I think the claim about women's intelligence, I think we don't fully have all the information we need, but at some level, if you could really get a hard measure on intelligence, even if it was quite a narrow one, as something like problem-solving ability or something like that, you might eventually be able to get that claim down to the epistemic status of something like that the Earth is flat. As regards to slavery, when I say morally false, I think and I think I'm just revealing myself as kind of just a brute force consequentialist in this conversation, is I think there's layers of intuition, right? And I think what Rawls wants to do is just say, we've got this complete map of all the different ones, and we're going to try and draw a circle that sort of, we get some on the inside and some on the outside and get the most coherent circle possible. I would say there's some that are more fundamental than others. So I would say our intuition that suffering is undesirable is sort of more fundamental in a sense than our intuition. So like my intuition that there's something off about kidney sales, I should be open to being overridden by evidence that there would be less suffering in the world if we allowed it. And I think you can see this really clearly in something like mathematics, right? Where there's this famous thing where Thomas Hobbes, the political philosopher, reads Pythagoras' theorem and he goes, well, that's obviously wrong. And then he reads the axioms and the steps. And then his intuition of like the laws of addition overrides his intuition that this square angles of a triangle, I forget what the theorem is even, is wrong. And I think something similar can happen in moral terms,
in but some cases.
But there's so much more uncertainty built in.
So I agree with you. So one way to think about it is both might seem both depressing on the one hand, but less depressing, on the other hand. And the thought here is this: that in just the same way as there are some postulates or at least axioms in mathematics which you just cannot prove, in a non-question begging way, so it is in some cases in ethics. So you mentioned the thought that causing suffering needlessly is morally wrong. Another one that my former doctoral supervisor Jerry Cohen was fond of invoking is the principle of fundamental equality. So the idea that unless you have a good reason not to, you ought to work on the assumption that other human beings are your moral equal. That's the default. That's the starting point. Now, Cohen used to say and writes, and others do, that you can't really show that to be true. In a way that's non-question begging, and in a secular way. Once you've given up on saying God has created us equal, therefore, then you really struggle to find the tools, to justify, the principle of fundamental equality. So that's the depressing bit. The depressing bit says, well, then we are left, with an utterly groundless, morality. The less depressing bit is twofold. It consists in saying, well, is morality less grounded in this sense that mathematics, that's question number one, or less depressing bit number one. The less depressing bit number two consists in acknowledging that the overwhelming majority of people who are intellectually serious, by which I don't mean, academics or professional philosophers, but, anyone who generally wants to think about those issues in an honest way, they all believe in the principle of fundamental equality. The disagreements, have to do with who falls within the scope, of the principle. So do women fall within the scope of the principle? Do primates, fall within the scope, of the principle? The disagreements also have to do, once we have agreed on the scope, have to do with what follows, from the requirement that we should treat, one another as equals. And there you can make progress. And I'll give you an example, with the case of women, since you brought it up yourself. You can make progress by pointing to internal contradictions, in the other parties in a position. And one of the best examples I can think of in this respect is G.A. Smill's work on the subjection of women. It's an extraordinary piece of work, because what he does is that he dismantles, to, in my view, enormous rhetorical effect. He dismantles inch by inch, arguments aiming to show that women are not men's equals. But he does so by pointing out internal contradictions, in those arguments. So if you think X, then you cannot consistently affirm that women are not, men's, equal. And I think that's the best way. I mean, in many cases, it seems to me that that's the best way, to make progress.
Yeah, so I've got a few thoughts here. Let me just pull them together. First of all, Mill is my favourite philosopher.
Oh, good.
And
That's good.
it's only added to by how really startlingly ahead of the curve he was on women's rights, on like ex-slave populations and so on.
Absolutely.
Thinking about this idea of what are we really anchoring moral value systems to, there's internal and external contradictions, right? So the contradiction I was talking about with women's equality was that in some sense we actually are getting close to being able to say we actually just know with an epistemic certainty of something like science that some of the claims of an innate inequality just don't line up to the world. Now, with regards to so I think we should always be ready to have our moral theories overridden when they're in contradiction to sort of facts that have an epistemic certainty of science. Then there's also the internal thing. I think I might be a little more optimistic than you in saying that some of what you called brute force moral assertions, I think you're not going to get the epistemic certainty of the earth is round. What you might get is something a bit like I think, therefore I am. And I made this same argument with Roger Crisp when I was talking utilitarianism with him. In that I think therefore I am is sort of one of these well-known things. You really can't doubt your own consciousness, right? But then it's not that much of a step from there to say it's really difficult to doubt that there are different. I think the word experiences gets misused in philosophy. There are different aspects of your consciousness. There are different things it can do. There are different. Let's just use the word experiences. There's different experiences within consciousness. And you sort of know some of them are more or less desirable than others. And if you sort of say, well, in virtue of what are they desirable? There's nothing outside of that you can anchor it to. But it's really sort of quite difficult to doubt that there are distinct experiences within consciousness, and that we'd rather some of them over others. And then you can just map forward from there. And in terms of equality of persons, all you really need to grant me is that we're not solipsists. We assume other people have consciousness and internal lives as well. And if they do, and they're at least comparable to ours, then they matter in the same way that ours do.
Well, so that's the step that, an absolute egoist, might, and a consistent egoist might deny. And this is where it becomes difficult. Right, so you can imagine someone say, well, yes, those people are like me and I'm like them in fundamental respects, but, so long as I don't ask that they treat me in particular ways, why should I treat them?
So, I mean, here I'm going to say something which I think will maybe alarm some, is that it seems to me they're just two separate questions. There's I sort of know my own conscious experience, right?
Right,
And I can have preferences about where I move within that space.
right,
And there's what's desirable for me, and then there's what's
right,
desirable total for all conscious creatures.
right, right,
Those are just separate questions, and they I think they align more than we might think. I think
right.
behaving in manifestly unethical ways tends to lead to more suffering for ourselves, but that's not an iron law. There will be cases where they
Yeah.
diverge.
So I think so this is where it's clear that you are more optimistic than I am. But so my worry is precisely with those cases, where it's not clear at all, that the agent will benefit, whether subjectively or objectively, actually, from acting, in ways which I regard as ethical. Can I go back to your science book? Because there was a very interesting news story in the UK this past week. I don't know whether you've seen this in the US, though it matters to the US. It's to do with lobsters. Have you seen that? So the traditional
Right.
way of cooking lobsters is to boil them, slowly. You put them in water live and conscious, and then the water is brought to a boil, so the lobster is boiled alive. And the argument in favor of, or meant to show that it was all right to do it that way, always was that they didn't feel pain. But it seems actually, I mean, some scientists have tried to show that contrary to what we have thought, lobsters do feel pain. They are sentient. They have a central nervous system, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a very, very good example, of where, in the face of science, that we have no choice, but to revise, our judgments as to, how. I mean, that's even assuming that the case for vegetarianism has not been made. But we have to revise, our judgments, normative judgments about how, what is the best way, to behave towards, this particular creature.
So that would be a perfect example now of a sort of one intuition being
Yes,
overridden by a more
exactly.
fundamental one. So
Yeah,
we have an
exactly.
intuition that it's just a big sea
That's right.
bug and I can boil it if I want to.
That's right.
And then
That's right.
actually
Yeah.
that's overridden via one of these scientific epistemic facts
That's right.
about the world, that it's overridden by the intuition that suffering is bad.
Exactly. Exactly. So we have that fundamental intuition that suffering is bad, from which we derive more specific intuitions based on certain facts. And when those facts are wrong, turn out to be wrong, i.e., it is the case, let's assume for the argument that lobsters feel pain, then we have to abandon the more specific intuition that it's morally acceptable to boil a lobster alive.
Right.
So I think that's a very good example, and recent, example, of how to do, this particular kind of work.
And then you can just scale that up to human society, right? And now, obviously, once you scale it up to human society, it's just infinitely more complicated, right? The lobster one's quite binary. It feels pain or it doesn't, or to what degree, right?
Yeah.
Whereas with humans, clearly we're talking. I get into all of this with Roger Crisp, so I don't want to redo that conversation, but clearly we're talking a much more complex network of variables. It's not just a simple benthamite pleasure minus pain. There's all sorts of things we desire.
Yeah.
And as soon as we talk about it, even to use a word like desire or preference or good or bad, we're applying concepts to that experience, which in themselves are very vague, very imprecise.
And very problematic, yeah.
Exactly. And then even if the concepts were clear, the methodological, even if we understood exactly at the level of the brain what's desirable for us, which we don't, like how you'd actually actualize that in the world, given how complex political and economic and social systems are. But with all that, go ahead.
I mean, not least because we each, every single one of us, have different desires, which are quite often mutually incompatible. The fulfillment of which fulfillments of which quite often are incompatible with each other, and so on and so forth. So I agree, if you scale it up, as you put it, then it becomes enormously complicated.
Okay, well, we've run over time a little, so that seems like a good place to wrap up. Professor, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the first ever episode of the Political Philosophy Podcast. This is a free podcast. I'm doing this purely as a passion project, so no charge, no fee. The one thing I'm asking of the audience, if you did like the show, is help us build a bigger audience. This will help me get better and better guests on in the future. So nothing major, but if you do want to hear more episodes like this, one thing you could do to help out is just share this episode or the site for the podcast generally on your own social media. One thing I've been asking some friends to do is like our Facebook page, which is just at Political Philosophy Podcast. And then under the communities section, Facebook has an option where you can invite your friends to like the page. So just like our Facebook page, which again is at Political Philosophy Podcast, and then just invite anyone and everyone who you know who has an interest in either politics or philosophy, or you think might be into this sort of thing. My guest next week will be the Fordham Law Professor, gubernatorial and congressional candidate, and anti-corruption campaigner, Zephyr Teachow. Zephyr's a pretty amazing woman who literally wrote the book on corruption in American history, and for those of you who know New York State politics, has been a really big force in dragging the New York State Democrats more towards the left and away from a more corporatist Democrat direction. She's also just been a tireless advocate against rulings like Citizens United. So we had a really great conversation where we talked both about corruption, but also about what it means as people of the left to be citizens in Trump's America. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you'll come back to join us for it then. Once again, just to stay up to date with these and get the new episodes, you can like, follow, subscribe on social media platforms of your choice, and all those links are available at our website, which is just politicalphilosophypodcast.com. politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Thanks again for listening. This has been just a blast for me, but I do hope at least some other people enjoy it as well. And if you know someone you think might, please help out by just forwarding, sharing, getting the word out there for a new and I hope really exciting project.